Hey guys, what is going on? So we're back here on the Conquer Coaches chat, and on this chat we're going to talk about hypertrophy and is hypertrophy important within inside the sport of CrossFit. Okay, I don't want to get too scientific with myofibrils and myocytes and what happens biologically to muscles increasing size, etc. But we'll quickly mention that. So pretty much in the simplest form, muscles increase size through muscle fibers. Okay, and as muscle fibers increase, the muscle is going to get bigger. The muscle cross-sectional area is going to make that muscle bigger. In its simplest, easiest form, without trying to go down an anatomy class. So the question comes down to, is hypertrophy important within inside the sport of CrossFit? And I'm glancing to my right because I have a bunch of questions that are kind of guiding this for you guys that can give you some good information and stuff to take home with. And size is important. We know that, right? Because we know that larger muscles have the potentiation for developing and expressing more strength. More strength has a potentiation for expressing more power. But there's always, in everything we do, going to be that inverted U theory where, yes, we're getting the muscles bigger, we're creating more strength, creating more power, but then at some point are the muscles going to become too big and the strength and power ratios are way off as it pertains to the demands of the sport, where now it takes away from other areas of fitness components needed to be successful within inside the sport of CrossFit. And that's something that we have to think about for everything within inside the sport, is where is that point of diminishing return as it relates to the various necessities for success with various modalities inside the sport. And that pertains to hypertrophy too. But at the same point where hypertrophy becomes important is we need it not just for strength and power, but we also need to have the bigger muscles, the bigger body to sustain the work over the course of a competition. And we see this with a lot of athletes. Yes, we have outliers like the Haley Adams who are more, I'm going to say quote unquote, on the, I don't want to say thin, but on the leaner side within inside the sport of CrossFit, who are able to sustain and last this high power output over the span of the CrossFit Games week or weekend. But for the people who have the longest longevity within inside the sport, who are able to really withstand the demands of the sport, whether it's over years or within inside that competition of itself, have a larger build to them. And yes, there is still that inverted U theory with that, meaning too large of a build pulls away from the ability to sustain high aerobic outputs as the sport requires. Too small of a build prohibits them to sustain the competition if there's heavy demands of external loading to the body, right? It's going to wear on them more. So this does become important with hypertrophy inside the sport, okay? And we need that. We need the person to have a specific size to them. In every sport, every professional sport, athletes are going to have a specific build. Yes, there will be outliers for every sport, but for the most part, 90% of the athletes are going to have a specific genetic build: limb length, height to weight ratio, muscular size development, shoulder structure, limb structure, limb length, limb weight. There's always going to be that for sports, and CrossFit is no different. So from a training perspective, what do we want to think about with hypertrophy? When should we be doing this? I think hypertrophy training is very important to implement within inside the beginning part of the year. Why? For a couple of reasons. The one is, if we're looking to strip stress away from the body, we need to have a slight form of transition within inside their programming and training to get them going for the next year. That's the point to put it in, because we're coming off this high intense competition phase of snatching, clean and jerking, muscle ups, handstand push-ups, intense mixed modal work. The body's gonna be pretty broken down at the end of the competition season. Going into a bodybuilding program, a program looking to build size, can pull stress away from the body, stress away from the joints, depending on the movements that we select. It can add another path of just helping get that body back to homeostasis as we pull back intensity and look to put on some size through volume, specific volume training, right, as it relates to hypertrophy. Now, throughout the programming year, I like to come back to hypertrophy training in all phases. I'll still have it in there with specific muscle groups. For some athletes, I might put a higher emphasis of hypertrophy work with hamstring development if they're poor pullers. If someone has higher fatigue limiters with eccentric squatting or knee flexion patterns, then I'll put maybe some extra hypertrophy work with inside the quads and the glutes. Same thing with the upper body. So I'll still sprinkle in hypertrophy work as with inside the areas of the programming, with inside the intensification phase and even the competition phase as I need to. But the primary focus of it for me lies within inside that transition part, that developmental phase within inside their programming, right? Now, with that, it's not going to be a full bodybuilding-esque program. What I'm looking to do is rebalance them, get them back to some sort of normalcy from a homeostatic state, as well as a neurological state and a metabolic state coming off the competition phase. I'm also going to use that to put some size in there, as I want to use that for potentiation for where I want them to go with strength and power development, for them to either stay where they are, get to the next phase. Stay where they are, meaning if they are a games athlete and I want to get them back to the games, I want them to stay at the games. What's needed for that, right? If it's someone that's looking to make gains within inside the sport, whether it's get to the semifinals, do better the open, what's needed? What's that potentiation I need to create now to give them a better platform and base for them to get to where they need to be? And that's the main thing that I'm thinking about with hypertrophy work as it relates back to the sport of CrossFit. So how can I use this as a stepping stone, as a block to build and layer this baseline for them to give them the potentiation of power or strength and power as we need it down the road, okay? So that's the main thing. Now, what kind of movements do I like to utilize for this? I'm a fan of simplistic movements. Am I gonna do pec flies, banded pec flies? No, I'm not from a potentiation standpoint. Am I completely against them though? No. If sometimes we need to put things like that in to help with temperament, mood, energy, familiarity, likeness, then yeah, I'm gonna put that in. But I'm using more the compound foundational movements for that hypertrophy work. It's the 6 foundational movement patterns, right? So lunge, squat, hinge, push, pull, carry. I'm going to take those 6 foundational patterns and I'm going to use the key elements of those patterns to develop hypertrophy work. So lunges, hinging patterns, lower body push patterns, squats, upper body push pull patterns, and carries. With inside upper body push pull, curls, tricep extensions, lateral delt raise, front delt raise, rear delt raise, yes, 100%. Trap raises, well, to an extent, it looks really cool. Is it going to provide benefit within inside the sport of CrossFit? Maybe if I'm looking to create a larger shelf to hold a weight over volume and carrying something on our backs, yeah. If I need to use that as a form to increase my grip strength for farmers carries, yeah, right? So you can kind of see the carryover and transferability of some movements. I'm going to put in with hypertrophy work potential drop sets, potential Poliquin drop sets, potential threshold work. What does that mean? 6 strict pull-ups, 12 dumbbell bicep curls, 24 gorilla rows, right? And I might flip-flop it in some fashion. I apologize for being a little jumbled. I didn't prepare this talk, so I'm trying to give this to you as real as possible from a discussional standpoint. Now that work that I just described right there, those drop sets, that's going to help with building potentiation for threshold work, for withstanding lactate buildup for a lot of athletes as well, doing it in a pattern that can be taken away from, like, high volume pull-ups and chest bar pull-ups if we need a rest from those joint loading contractions, right? So that's where I'm getting at with that. You can see how that can carry over. I know I have to work on somebody's tricep or push endurance, but I want to stay away from handstand push-ups for a little bit. Okay, well, maybe I want to stay away from any sort of like wrist flexion standpoint. Maybe I'm going to go with dumbbell strict presses, drop set into ring push-ups, drop set into banded tricep press down. So you can see how I'm using some bodybuilding work to build hypertrophy, to build size, but also increase the resiliency with lactate buildup, okay? So that's how that can work as well. So I don't have set prescription patterns of movements that I love. What I do like to utilize are the core movements for the 6 foundational movement patterns of the lunge, hinge, squat, push, pull, carry. Those core patterns I like to use the foundational movements for and work in hypertrophy work around those patterns. And yeah, we can throw in some extra stuff to have fun. If it's the complete off season, we want to do banded flies, dumbbell flies, whatever. Why not have fun with it? But if you're truly looking to utilize hypertrophy of the sport, think about what potentiation this is giving them for success as you progress deeper within inside the program for them. Now, what are the benefits of hypertrophy with CrossFit? I discussed this earlier, but a few things. Number one, I think having the right size for athletes, again, not too lean, not too big. We saw this at last year's games where there's some athletes that looked like straight bodybuilder physiques. I was like, wow, like they look like straight bodybuilders. And as I expected, it didn't pan out well for them over the span of the week. And then you have the athletes that are too lean, where when there's heavy loading, heavy external loading on the body, it takes a higher toll. It creates more stress, it creates more fatigue for them, right? So I want to use this work to set them up for success within inside the sport, to be able to express the demands of that competition as outlined by the people who put the competition on. And I say that because if we're speaking in general terms here, whether we're going from the games or weekend competition, what have you, you want to be able to utilize the size as a form to express the demands of where you are of that competition. If you're too big and you have to do lots of endurance work over the span of 4, 5, 6 days, well, it's going to take a larger toll on your body. If you're too lean, too small, and you have to do a competition over 4, 5, 6 days, and those days are going to have lots of workouts of barbells, odd objects, heavy external loading to the structural system, well, that can create more fatigue. So you want to be able to have that size that fits that proper middle ground in a proper height to weight ratio of who you are, that can drive success for the demands of the sport. And that's really what you're thinking about as you're looking at hypertrophy to be successful for the sport of CrossFit. How much would I recommend? So how much hypertrophy training would I recommend? To me, it comes down to the time of the season, right? So if we're in that transitional phase and then that accumulation phase of the programming, so the beginning stages of the programming, it might be 3-4 days a week, maybe 5 days a week, depending if we're really stripping back and having a solid transition within inside the programming before we start adding in more of the larger dynamic movements. Well, it might be 5 days a week of work. For some athletes that need less of a transition, less of a switch, it might be 2-3 days a week with inside that beginning accumulation phase. As we transition with the phases, it might shift to maybe 2-3 days a week. It's being put in at the back end of their training day, right? And as we switch into the competitive phase, it might get put back to maybe 3-4 days a week if I'm trying to manage fatigue, get some extra touches, but again, manage fatigue and stress of the overall training day, training week that's being applied to them. So in my opinion, it's not a set description of the recommended dosage. What you really want to think about is what's appropriate for this athlete at the phases that I'm in. So if it's in the beginning phase, what do I need to do to set them up for success for the next phase, and for what their goal is? What's that potentiation I have to create now? Do I have to create a bunch of size in that athlete and create size with them? Okay, well, I need to do more. Do they already have a good size, but I want to just manage fatigue and stress, have some transition here and set them up for success? Well, I don't need to do as much, right? As I transition phases, it's about fatigue management, right? So what's happening? How much fatigue am I putting on this athlete? Do I need to utilize some hypertrophy work to manage fatigue and strip away some stress? Do I need to manage fatigue add more hypertrophy because based off their genetic makeup, I need to keep that hypertrophy work in so they don't strip away the size that we already built, and or are we doing a ton of endurance work and mixed motor work that can make them too lean come competition time, so I have to supplement in more hypertrophy work to keep that size on them, right? So these are all things that you have to think about as a coach as you're thinking about hypertrophy work. And just like with anything, there's no one size fits all. It's what's appropriate for your athlete that's going to allow them to be successful. It's going to allow them to manage the prescription being applied, and it's going to set them up for success for what their goals are. The last question is, can there be a downside to this type of training for CrossFit athletes? You know, there can really be a downside with everything that we do, right? Too much of anything can have a negative effect. Not enough can have a negative effect. And I think where the negative effect comes into play here is when we do too much of it and it puts on inappropriate size. Inappropriate size meaning you're adding size that can create more fatigue by having to exert more energy because now your muscles are larger, you might weigh more. Or if it puts on size that restricts proper movement patterns because you have too much size, too much muscle mass put on around certain areas. Or if you did too much work and didn't maintain proper fluidity of movement patterns, which limits your ability to move properly, which then can also exert more energy. So if you think about those three things, that can all create pitfalls for the athlete, right? So if you don't do enough of it, you can have ways of just adding too much stress to the neurological, metabolic, or structural system by too much of the same stuff over the span of years, right? You could also limit someone's potentiation for strength and power due to lack of muscle size, the muscle cross-sectional area. So not doing enough can also have pitfalls. So there's pros and cons to everything, and that's why I said when you're thinking about hypertrophy work for the sport of CrossFit, it's very important to have it in there to help with fatigue management and to help with transitional work coming out of a competition season. It's very important to help with having potentiation for strength and power. It's very important for putting on some size to the person as it's needed to withstand the rigors of a competition and what's being prescribed for them. But also not enough of it can have, also too much of it can have pitfalls of improper movement patterns, too much size, which can create too much fatigue and exert too much energy. At the same point, not doing enough can have problems as well because you're not giving someone potentiation for more strength and power if they need it. You're also limiting someone's size, which the rigors of too much external loading on the structural system can create too much fatigue, too much energy expenditure, and they can't keep up, right? So there's always this give and take with everything, but the most important thing to think about is what does this athlete need to be successful based on what their goals are. So yes, hypertrophy training in the right dosages at the right time is very important within inside the sport for the sport of CrossFit. So hope this answered your questions. I know it seemed a little jumbled, and I did that on purpose, right? I wanted to go into this without having a full script because I feel like anybody can prepare and give you a great talk. I wanted to really treat it like if we were sitting next to each other and you just asked this question, how would I answer this question for you off the top of my head? And that's what I try to do. So I hope you found it beneficial. Any questions, shoot them back to me. Let me know what questions you might have, and we'll have the next coaches chat ready to drop next week. Thanks, guys.